The conference room at Vortex Solutions hummed with quiet efficiency as Scott signed the final licensing agreement, his hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Jennifer Morrison, Vortex's CEO, extended her hand across the polished mahogany table, her grip firm and her smile genuine. Around them, lawyers shuffled documents into leather portfolios, their work complete. The patent that Scott had filed 18 years ago on Professor Chen's advice, the technology he'd created in his cramped apartment during those uncertain freelance days, now belonged to him in a way Nexcore had never managed to claim. Marcus Rodriguez sat beside Scott, radiating professional satisfaction. The attorney had structured the deal with surgical precision. $4.2 million up front, 3% royalties on all revenue generated by the adaptive load distribution system, equity representing 0.7% of Vortex Solutions, and a consulting position at $12,000. Monthly, but the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what made Scott's chest tighten with emotion. It was the employment contract stacked in Jennifer's assistant's arms, 47 identical offers, each representing a Nexcore engineer who would transition to Vortex with enhanced compensation and unprecedented job security. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, studying Scott with undisguised curiosity. She had built Vortex from a struggling startup into a regional powerhouse through calculated acquisitions and strategic partnerships, but she'd never encountered someone who negotiated against their own financial interests to protect colleagues who'd watched him get escorted out by security. The business journals would call Scott's move naive, leaving millions on the table to fund salary increases for people who hadn't defended him. Jennifer called it leadership. 3 miles across the city, Ethan Blackwell sat in Nexcore's executive suite, staring at the email that had arrived from Vortex's legal department 20 minutes earlier. The message was professionally worded but brutally clear. Vortex Solutions was withdrawing from acquisition negotiations effective immediately. They had secured the necessary intellectual property through alternative channels and no longer required Nexcore's involvement. Ethan read the paragraph 3 times, his mind refusing to process the implications. The $180 million deal, the transaction that would have transformed his career and secured his legacy, had evaporated. His phone erupted with incoming calls, board members, investors, the CFO. Ethan ignored them all, his attention fixed on the second email that had arrived moments after Vortex's withdrawal notice. This one came from Maya Patel and carried 46 additional signatures, every engineer in the department. The message was brief and devastating. They were resigning effective in 2 weeks, having accepted positions at Vortex Solutions. The email thanked Nexcore for the opportunity, but noted that they were pursuing roles that offered better alignment with their professional values and career objectives. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened his desk drawer and retrieved the bottle of scotch he kept for celebrating major deals. He poured 3 fingers into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd terminated Scott Walsh to eliminate what he'd perceived as dead weight, an aging engineer whose salary could be replaced by 2 junior developers. That decision, made casually over a conference call with HR, had triggered a cascade of consequences he'd never imagined possible. The board meeting was scheduled for 4 o'clock. Ethan knew what awaited him. Without the Vortex acquisition, Nexcore's valuation would plummet. Without the engineering team, they couldn't maintain existing client relationships or develop new products. Without Scott's patent, which Ethan had foolishly assumed Nexcore owned through some vague notion of corporate entitlement, they had no competitive advantage. The company he'd spent 8 years building into an acquisition target had become a hollowed shell in less than 3 weeks. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from the board chairman, a terse summons to arrive early for a private discussion before the full board convened. The subtext was unmistakable. They were going to ask for his resignation, probably offering some face-saving severance package in exchange for a quiet departure. He'd become the very thing he'd labeled Scott Walsh: redundant, dead weight, a liability to be efficiently eliminated. Across town, Scott stood in Vortex's lobby, surrounded by engineers who'd begun arriving for preliminary orientation sessions. Maya Patel approached him, her expression mixing gratitude and residual guilt. She'd been among those who'd watched silently as security escorted him out of NextScore, paralyzed by shock and fear for her own position. Now she was here because Scott had insisted on protecting people who hadn't protected him. James Chen joined them, carrying coffee and wearing the first genuine smile Scott had seen on his face in months. The younger engineer had worked alongside Scott for 6 years, learning system architecture and debugging techniques through countless late nights. He'd felt ashamed watching Scott's termination, angry at his own cowardice. Scott's deal had given him something unexpected: a second chance to work with integrity. Jennifer Morrison emerged from the elevator bank, her assistant trailing behind with tablets and folders. She'd scheduled the afternoon for onboarding logistics, but first she wanted Scott to address the assembled engineers. They needed to hear from the person who'd restructured an entire corporate acquisition to ensure their futures, who'd valued their careers above his own maximum profit. Scott stepped forward, facing colleagues who'd become something more through this crucible. His voice was steady as he began speaking, explaining Vortex's vision and culture, outlining the projects they'd tackle together. But mostly he talked about second chances and the responsibility that came with them, lessons he'd learned through betrayal and vindication, through 18 years of loyalty that had been discarded in a 20-minute security escort, and through the unexpected discovery that protecting others could be its own form of victory. The digital clock on Scott's nightstand glowed 3:47 a.m., mocking his futile attempts at sleep. He'd been staring at the ceiling for hours, replaying the security escort on an endless loop, feeling the weight of 18 years reduced to a cardboard box and a humiliating perp walk. Finally abandoning any pretense of rest, Scott shuffled to his kitchen, brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint, and opened his laptop at the small dining table that had witnessed countless late-night debugging sessions for NextScore. He typed the company name into the search bar, not sure what he was looking for, maybe just confirmation that NextScore still existed, that his termination hadn't somehow erased the entire organization from reality. The first results were standard corporate propaganda: press releases about innovation, client testimonials, the usual digital mythology companies constructed about themselves. But halfway down the second page, a headline from a business journal caught his attention: NextScore Vortex merger stalls amid IP concerns. Scott clicked through, his pulse quickening as he read. Vortex Solutions, a regional powerhouse with 3 times NextScore's revenue, had announced acquisition intentions 6 weeks ago. The deal was valued at $180 million, representing a massive windfall for NextScore's investors and executive team. But according to the article, Vortex's due diligence team had discovered complications regarding intellectual property ownership. The merger had stalled in legal review, with both companies declining detailed comment beyond vague statements about resolving technical matters. He opened another tab, then another, piecing together fragments from trade publications, investor forums, and business news sites. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Vortex wanted NextScore specifically for its adaptive load distribution technology, the system that allowed dynamic resource allocation across distributed networks. That technology was NextScore's crown jewel, the foundation of every product they'd built over the past 18 years. It was also, Scott realized with a jolt that made him spill coffee across his keyboard, something he'd invented. The memory surfaced with crystalline clarity. 18 years ago, he'd been a freelance consultant, taking contract work while finishing his master's degree. Professor Raymond Chen, his thesis advisor, had connected him with NextScore's founders, who needed someone to architect their core platform. Scott had spent 3 months working from his apartment, building the adaptive load distribution system on his personal laptop during marathon coding sessions fueled by cheap pizza and cheaper beer. The system was elegant, revolutionary even. It could predict resource needs and redistribute computing power before bottlenecks formed, making it exponentially more efficient than competing technologies. 3 days after completing the prototype, NextScore had offered him a full-time position. He'd been 29 years old, drowning in student loans and desperate for stability. The salary seemed astronomical compared to his freelance rates. He'd signed the employment contract without reading it carefully, eager to start building something permanent. But before he'd signed anything, Professor Chen had pulled him aside with advice that had seemed paranoid at the time. File a patent first, the professor had insisted. Protect your work before you become an employee. Companies have ways of claiming everything you create, even ideas you developed independently. Scott had followed the advice mostly to humor his mentor, filing patent number 8532991 for adaptive load distribution in distributed computing environments 72 hours before his official start date at NextScore. Scott abandoned his coffee-soaked keyboard and retrieved the cardboard box from his termination, dumping its contents across his dining table. Beneath the framed photos and the coffee-stained company mug, he found what he was looking for, a folder containing his original patent certificate, yellowed with age but still official. He'd kept it as a memento, a reminder of his first significant technical achievement, never imagining it might matter beyond sentimental value. He read through the patent documentation with fresh eyes, noting the filing date, the detailed technical specifications, the claims that described exactly how his system functioned. Then he retrieved his employment contract from a filing cabinet, the document he'd signed with such optimism 18 years ago. He read it carefully this time, searching for patent assignment clauses, intellectual property transfer agreements, any language that might have given NextScore ownership of his work. The contract contained standard IP provisions requiring him to assign any inventions created during his employment using company resources. But the language was specific, during the term of employment and using company equipment or facilities. Scott's adaptive load distribution system had been created 3 days before his employment began, on his personal laptop in his apartment. The patent had been filed in his name alone. NextScore had never requested formal assignment of the patent, apparently assuming that his employment somehow transferred ownership automatically. The implications crashed over Scott like a wave. NextScore's entire platform, every product they'd built, every client relationship they'd established, rested on technology he owned. The $180 million Vortex acquisition depended on NextScore's ability to transfer intellectual property they didn't actually possess. No wonder the deal had stalled during due diligence. Vortex's lawyers had discovered that NextScore couldn't legally convey the core technology that made the acquisition valuable. Scott's hands shook as he reached for his phone. It was 4:30 in the morning, too early to call anyone, but he couldn't wait. He composed an email to Professor Chen, explaining the situation and asking for recommendations for intellectual property attorneys. The professor responded within minutes. Apparently Scott wasn't the only one awake at ungodly hours. Chen provided a name, Marcus Rodriguez, a sharp IP lawyer who'd helped several of the professor's former students navigate patent disputes with employers. Scott sent Marcus a message immediately, attaching scans of his patent certificate and employment contract. He didn't expect a response until business hours, but his phone rang 15 minutes later. Marcus Rodriguez had a voice like gravel and the direct manner of someone who'd seen every corporate trick in the book. "I've reviewed your documents," Marcus said without preamble. "Your ownership is ironclad. The patent was filed during your freelance period, the code was written on personal equipment, and your employment contract contains no retroactive assignment clause. NextScore has no legal claim to your intellectual property." Scott felt dizzy. "But they've been using it for 18 years. Doesn't that create some kind of implied license?" "They've been using it without permission," Marcus corrected. "That's called infringement." However, given the length of time and your employment relationship, a court would likely find an implied license for past use. But that doesn't transfer ownership, and it doesn't give them the right to sell or transfer the technology to a third party like Vortex. So the acquisition can't happen without my permission. Correct. Without your patent, Nexcore cannot legally transfer the core technology to Vortex. The entire $180 million deal is impossible to complete unless you agree to license or sell your intellectual property. Scott thought about the termination email, the security escort, the casual cruelty of being discarded after 18 years. What are my options? Marcus's tone shifted, becoming almost gleeful. Mr. Walsh, you have all the options. Nexcore has none. I suggest we schedule a meeting to discuss strategy. But first, don't communicate with anyone at Nexcore. They're going to contact you very soon, and they're going to be desperate. Let me handle all communications. After hanging up, Scott sat in the pre-dawn darkness, his mind racing. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Blackwell was probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that the employee he'd terminated as dead weight held the key to his company's survival. The irony was almost poetic. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days after Scott had signed the representation agreement with Marcus Rodriguez. Scott was drinking coffee and reviewing technical documentation Marcus had requested when his phone erupted with an unfamiliar number. He let it ring through to voicemail, following Marcus's instructions to avoid direct contact with Nexcore. The voicemail notification appeared seconds later, and Scott couldn't resist listening. Ethan Blackwell's voice filled his kitchen, tight with barely controlled fury. The CEO, who'd never spoken directly to Scott during 18 years of employment, now demanded an immediate callback, citing urgent business matters requiring Scott's attention. The message lasted 90 seconds, oscillating between thinly veiled threats and forced cordiality. Scott forwarded it to Marcus without responding. Marcus called back within the hour, his tone amused. Ethan had already contacted him 3 times that morning, each call more desperate than the last. Nexcore's legal team had apparently informed their CEO that Scott's patent ownership was unassailable, and Vortex's attorneys were threatening to walk away from the acquisition entirely unless the intellectual property situation resolved within 2 weeks. Ethan was, in Marcus's professional assessment, losing his mind. The second call came that afternoon, this time to Marcus's office with Scott conferenced in silently. Ethan's strategy had shifted from rage to legal intimidation. He claimed Nexcore possessed implied rights to the patent based on 18 years of continuous use and Scott's employment relationship. The company would pursue legal action if Scott attempted to interfere with their legitimate business operations. Marcus listened patiently, then dismantled each argument with surgical precision, citing case law and patent statutes until Ethan's bluster collapsed into silence. When threats failed, Ethan pivoted to negotiation. He offered $50,000 for a full patent assignment, presenting it as generous compensation for technology Scott had created nearly 2 decades ago. Marcus countered that the Vortex acquisition valued Nexcore at $180 million primarily because of Scott's technology, making $50,000 roughly equivalent to offering someone a sandwich for their house. Ethan increased his offer to $200,000. Marcus terminated the call. The third approach came 2 days later and proved more insidious. Ethan scheduled an all-hands meeting at Nexcore, mandatory attendance for all engineering staff. Scott learned about it from Maya Patel, who sent a carefully worded text message asking if he was aware of the situation. Scott wasn't, but he suspected what was coming. Maya's follow-up message arrived an hour after the meeting concluded, and it contained a recording. Someone had captured Ethan's speech on their phone, and the audio quality was surprisingly clear. Scott listened as Nexcore's CEO addressed the engineering team with practiced concern, explaining that a former employee was attempting to extort the company by claiming ownership of core technology. This individual, Ethan explained without naming Scott directly, was demanding millions of dollars and threatening to block the Vortex acquisition that would secure everyone's jobs and futures. Ethan's voice dripped with calculated emotion as he described the 47 engineers who might face unemployment if the deal collapsed. He painted a picture of families struggling, mortgages defaulting, careers destroyed, all because one vengeful ex-employee couldn't accept his termination gracefully. The speech was masterful manipulation, designed to turn Scott's former colleagues against him and create pressure through guilt and social censure. But Ethan Blackwell had made a critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated the intelligence and loyalty of the people who'd worked alongside Scott for years. Maya Patel was the first to act. As a senior developer who'd collaborated with Scott on dozens of projects, she knew his character and work ethic. Ethan's portrayal didn't match the man who'd mentored junior engineers, who debugged critical systems at 3 in the morning, who'd shared credit generously and accepted blame readily. She began asking questions, quietly at first, then more persistently. If Scott's patent claims were frivolous, why was Vortex threatening to abandon the acquisition? If Nexcore owned the technology, why couldn't they simply prove it and move forward? James Chen joined Maya's investigation, bringing his talent for research and documentation. He started compiling a timeline, cross-referencing Ethan's statements from various meetings and emails over the past 6 months. Inconsistencies emerged quickly. In March, Ethan had told the board that intellectual property due diligence was proceeding smoothly. In April, he'd assured investors that all patents and copyrights were properly assigned and documented. But internal emails James discovered through a friendly contact in legal told a different story. Nexcore's attorneys had identified the patent ownership issue in February and had been scrambling to resolve it quietly ever since. The most damning evidence came from corporate financial records that James accessed through channels he declined to specify. Ethan Blackwell had received a $3 million signing bonus when the Vortex acquisition letter of intent was executed. The engineering team, whose work had built the technology making the acquisition possible, had received nothing beyond their standard salaries. The bonus was structured to pay out regardless of whether the deal ultimately closed, meaning Ethan had already pocketed his reward while the people who'd created the actual value faced potential unemployment. Maya and James compiled their findings into a detailed document and shared it with the engineering team through encrypted channels. The response was swift and unified. If Ethan had lied about the bonus, what else had he misrepresented? If he'd known about the patent issue for months but proceeded anyway, hoping to resolve it after closing, what did that say about his leadership and ethics? Scott's phone began receiving messages from former colleagues. Carefully worded texts expressing support, sharing information, offering assistance. Maya sent him the complete documentation James had assembled, along with a note explaining that the engineering team understood what was really happening. They'd watched Scott get escorted out by security, and they'd felt ashamed of their silence. Now they had a chance to make it right. The messages troubled Scott as much as they encouraged him. These were good people, talented engineers with families and mortgages and lives that depended on stable employment. Ethan's warnings about 47 jobs at risk weren't entirely fabricated. If the Vortex deal collapsed and Nexcore's valuation plummeted, layoffs would inevitably follow. Scott's patent ownership gave him leverage, but wielding that leverage could harm people who'd done nothing wrong beyond failing to protest his termination loudly enough. He met with Marcus at the attorney's downtown office, spreading the documentation Maya had provided across a conference table. Marcus reviewed it methodically, occasionally making notes or highlighting specific passages. When he finished, he looked up at Scott with an expression mixing professional satisfaction and genuine respect. "This changes everything," Marcus said. "Ethan's been negotiating in bad faith, concealing material information from both Vortex and his own team. We can use this." "To do what?" Scott asked. "Destroy the company and put 47 people out of work." Marcus leaned back, studying his client. "Is that what you want?" Scott thought about Maya's text messages, about James's research, about engineers who'd reached out privately to express support they couldn't voice publicly. He thought about 18 years of late nights and weekend deployments, of code reviews and architecture discussions, of mentoring junior developers and celebrating project launches. Nextcore had been more than a job, it had been a community, a purpose, a significant portion of his adult life. "No," Scott said finally. "I want something better," Marcus smiled. "Then let's discuss strategy. Because I think I know how to give you exactly that." Over the next 2 hours, they outlined a plan that bypassed Nextcore entirely. Instead of negotiating with Ethan Blackwell, they would approach Vortex Solutions directly. Scott would offer to license his patent technology to Vortex, eliminating Nextcore from the equation. The licensing terms would be structured to benefit not just Scott, but the engineering team that had supported him. It was audacious, possibly unprecedented, and almost certainly legal. Marcus would need to research the specifics, but preliminary analysis suggested no contractual or regulatory barriers. Vortex wanted the technology, Scott owned it, and Nextcore's involvement was optional rather than essential. Scott left Marcus's office as afternoon shadows lengthened across the city, his mind churning with possibilities. Somewhere across town, Ethan Blackwell was probably strategizing his next move, confident that financial pressure and social manipulation would eventually force Scott to accept a modest settlement. The CEO had no idea that his former employee was about to change the game entirely. Marcus Rodriguez made the first contact on a Wednesday morning, placing a call directly to Vortex Solutions' general counsel. The conversation was brief and professionally cordial, with Marcus explaining that he represented the patent holder for the adaptive load distribution technology central to Vortex's proposed Nextcore acquisition. He had a proposal that might interest them, one that could resolve their due diligence concerns efficiently. Would they be willing to meet? Vortex's legal team agreed immediately. They'd spent 6 weeks navigating Ethan Blackwell's evasions and half-truths, watching a straightforward acquisition devolve into a legal quagmire. The prospect of dealing directly with the actual patent owner was refreshingly simple. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at Vortex's headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in the financial district that made Nextcore's offices look shabby by comparison. Scott arrived 30 minutes early, wearing the same suit he'd worn to his daughter's college graduation 3 years ago. Marcus met him in the lobby, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documentation. Jennifer Morrison, Vortex's CEO, led the meeting personally, a signal of how seriously they took the situation. She was flanked by her general counsel, CFO, and head of acquisitions, all of whom had spent considerable time analyzing Nextcore's technology and business model. Jennifer had built Vortex from a struggling startup into a regional powerhouse through calculated risk-taking and strategic acquisitions, and she had a reputation for cutting through corporate nonsense to reach practical solutions. Scott presented his proposal with the same methodical clarity he'd once used for technical architecture reviews. He would license patent 8532991 directly to Vortex Solutions, granting them perpetual rights to use, modify, and commercialize the adaptive load distribution technology. The licensing fee would be $4.2 million up front, plus 3% royalties on revenue generated by products utilizing the technology. Additionally, Scott requested 0.7% equity in Vortex and a consulting position at $12,000 monthly. The financial terms were substantial but reasonable, significantly less than what Vortex would pay to acquire all of Nextcore, and the royalty structure aligned Scott's interests with Vortex's long-term success. Jennifer's CFO was already calculating the numbers, nodding slightly as he recognized the deal's efficiency. But Scott wasn't finished. He had one non-negotiable condition that would determine whether any agreement moved forward. All 47 engineers currently employed in Nextcore's development department must receive employment offers from Vortex Solutions. The offers must include 15% salary increases over their current compensation, enhanced benefits packages, and contractual protection from layoffs for 2 years. Vortex would conduct standard background checks and technical interviews, but Scott required commitment that qualified engineers wouldn't be rejected arbitrarily. The room went silent. Jennifer exchanged glances with her leadership team, processing the unexpected demand. Acquisitions typically involved selective hiring, cherry-picking top talent while discarding redundant positions. Scott was insisting on wholesale team transfer as a prerequisite for licensing the technology that made the entire deal possible. Marcus had anticipated resistance and prepared accordingly. He slid a document across the table, the research James Chen had compiled, showing Ethan's $3 million bonus, the timeline of concealed patent issues, and the engineering team's actual contributions to NextScore's value. Marcus explained that Scott had deliberately structured his licensing fee to be $4.2 million rather than the $6 or $7 million the patent could command, specifically to fund the enhanced hiring package for the engineers. Scott leaned forward, his voice steady. These people built everything NextScore has become. They debugged systems at midnight, they mentored junior developers, they solved problems that seemed impossible. When I was terminated, they couldn't speak up. They have families, mortgages, lives that depend on employment. But they've supported me privately, shared information, taken risks to help me understand what was really happening. I won't profit from their work while leaving them vulnerable to NextScore's collapse. Jennifer Morrison studied Scott with undisguised fascination. She'd negotiated dozens of acquisitions and licensing deals, but she'd never encountered someone who deliberately reduced their own compensation to protect colleagues who hadn't defended them. The business journals would call it naive, leaving millions on the table for sentiment. Jennifer called it leadership. The Vortex team requested a 30-minute recess to discuss internally. Scott and Marcus waited in a conference room, drinking coffee and reviewing contingency plans. Marcus was confident but cautious. The deal was structured soundly, but corporate decision-making could be unpredictable. When Jennifer's team returned, her expression was unreadable. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and began speaking with the directness that had made her successful. Vortex would accept Scott's terms with minor modifications. They would conduct technical interviews with all 47 NextScore engineers over the next 2 weeks, with the understanding that candidates must meet Vortex's standard hiring criteria. However, Jennifer personally committed that the interviews would be conducted fairly, and she expected the vast majority of NextScore's engineering team to receive offers. The salary increases, enhanced benefits, and 2-year layoff protection would apply as Scott requested. The licensing fee and royalty structure were acceptable without modification. Vortex's equity offer would be 0.7% as requested, vesting over 4 years. Scott's consulting position would begin immediately, focusing on technology integration and team transition. Jennifer had one addition. She wanted Scott to lead the engineering team he'd protected, reporting directly to Vortex's CTO with significant autonomy over technical decisions. The role came with additional compensation and equity, reflecting the leadership responsibility. Scott felt emotion tighten his throat. He'd entered this meeting hoping to protect people who'd supported him quietly, never imagining he'd emerge with the opportunity to actually lead them in a new environment. He accepted Jennifer's terms immediately. The legal team spent the next 3 hours drafting preliminary agreements, with final contracts to be executed within 10 days pending due diligence completion. Marcus negotiated details while Scott answered technical questions about the patent's implementation and potential applications. Jennifer's acquisition team recognized that they were getting something better than the original NextScore deal, the core technology with clear ownership, a talented engineering team already familiar with the system, and leadership committed to long-term success rather than short-term profit extraction. As the meeting concluded, Jennifer walked Scott to the elevator bank privately. She'd built her career on reading people, on identifying talent and character beneath corporate facades. Scott Walsh had been terminated as dead weight, discarded after 18 years of loyalty. But he'd responded to betrayal not with vindictiveness, but with strategy, not with pure self-interest, but with concern for others. "I'm curious," Jennifer said as they waited for the elevator. "Why didn't you just license the patent for maximum value and walk away? You could have negotiated 8 or 9 million easily, maybe more. Why reduce your fee to fund salary increases for people who watched you get escorted out by security?" Scott considered the question carefully. "Because they're not the enemy. Ethan Blackwell made decisions that hurt all of us, me directly, them indirectly. The engineers who stayed silent during my termination weren't cowards. They were people protecting their families and careers in a system that punishes dissent. I had leverage. Through the patent, but leverage without purpose is just revenge. I wanted something better." The elevator arrived, but Jennifer didn't move to enter. "You're going to do well here, Scott. We need people who understand that business isn't just about maximizing individual outcomes, it's about building systems where talented people can thrive. Welcome to Vortex." 3 miles across the city, Ethan Blackwell was in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his assistant interrupted with unusual urgency. Vortex Solutions' general counsel was on the phone, requesting immediate conversation. Ethan took the call expecting an update on due diligence timelines. Instead, he received notification that Vortex was withdrawing from acquisition negotiations effective immediately. They had secured the necessary intellectual property through alternative channels and no longer required Nexcor's involvement. The call lasted 90 seconds, professionally cordial but absolutely final. Ethan sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The $180 million deal, the transaction that would have defined his career and secured his legacy, had evaporated. He tried calling back, demanding explanation, but Vortex's legal team declined to provide details beyond confirming their decision was final. His phone erupted with incoming calls, board members, investors, the CFO, all demanding answers he didn't have. And then, like a secondary explosion after the initial blast, his email chimed with a message from Maya Patel. It carried 46 additional signatures, every engineer in the development department. They were resigning effective in 2 weeks, having accepted positions at Vortex Solutions. Ethan read the message 3 times, each word hammering another nail into his career's coffin. Scott Walsh, the dead weight he'd terminated with such casual efficiency, had somehow orchestrated the complete destruction of everything Ethan had built. The patent Ethan had assumed Nexcor owned, the engineers he'd taken for granted, the acquisition he'd considered inevitable, all gone, transferred to a competitor through moves Ethan hadn't even seen coming.